What's going on, everybody? Welcome into another episode of A Nichols Worth. I'm your host, Keaton Nichols. You can catch me everywhere on the socials at Keaton D. Nichols. That's Keaton for anyone asking. Make sure you follow the show as well on Anchor. Best place to do that, anchor.fm/A Nichols Worth. That'll get you to where you need to go in terms of how to listen to our podcast and past editions of the show. Thank you for joining me here on a Tuesday. Shout out to all my folks joining me on Instagram, on Facebook, YouTube, and Twitch tonight. That's our programming lineup, our distribution lineup. Got DDG in the building. What's going on the Instagram? You could be on the show as well. The rules for this are really simple. If you would like in on the commentary, you just leave a comment, and I will read that comment for you here on the show. It's really just that simple, right? If you're on Facebook, YouTube, or Twitch, I will actually put that comment on the screen in some cases when I'm feeling froggy. But also shout out to our Instagram people, because I also read your comment if you're on Instagram as well. Love to see you too as well. I appreciate it. My Instagram folks always coming through. I appreciate it. So you could be like them. You could be like them. In on the conversation. Let's get to my headlines. We'll talk a little bit about France's effort to sort of push vaccine passports and whether or not that idea would float in the United States. And also Joe Biden in Philly today. Our headlines are sponsored by Parkour. Check out parkourtherapy.com. You can get 10% off your entire order using the promo code ANW2020. Yes, let's get right to it. Our first headline of the day. Let's put a little donation thing up there for in case you're feeling froggy in the wallet. The first one comes from Axios, and it says that Biden warns the 21st century Jim Crow assault is real. I read those words. I was like, dang, man, Jim Crow, he is making a lot of appearances. His name, rather, is making a lot of appearances in news over the last couple of years. Perhaps it's because people have come to have a greater understanding as to what the Jim Crow era of, if you will, the Jim Crow era, quote unquote, was like here in the United States, especially for black and brown people. Unfortunately, that's not why we hear so much of Jim Crow, that name, if you will, in the news. But Joe Biden invoked the name today. He was in Philadelphia, an interesting backdrop, I thought, for a speech today that sort of addressed sharply, if you will, condemned conservatives' most recent efforts to kind of squish voting rights across the country. Now, this has happened in a number of ways. And, you know, what was necessary in this situation is for Joe Biden to step up and say, look, I've got to represent as the head, as the king of the Democrats, the party in power here. I've really got to, I got to show strongly here against this push that Republicans are having to squish voting rights. That was what today was all about. I actually watched this speech on today live on the I think it was on the BNC, on the Black News Channel. Shout out to the BNC. Anyway, he said a lot of things during the course of the speech. It was a rousing speech. He was kind of upset, though, because Republicans in Congress already this year, just recently rather, have blocked the For the People Act, as well as the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. These are federal, voting rights bills, if you will, that in short, there's a lot of stuff kind of in these bills, but in short, the idea was to expand access that people had to voting. Right, expanding windows that people had to voting, expanding places and locations that people could vote, and in general, things like that to make it easier to vote. Now, the Republicans were against this for a number of reasons, and we're going to unpack some of those reasons tonight, and I'd love to know what you think about this as well. But just a little backstory: since the 2020 election, just a few months ago, it's almost a year ago, which is crazy to think about. But just last year in the 2020 election, I don't know if you had noticed, but the Republicans lost. Their guy lost. It was Donald Trump. And even though Donald Trump doesn't act like a Republican a lot of the time, he is still considered a Republican. But they lost, and that was a loss not just for Donald Trump, but it was a loss for the entire party. like, dang, we lost an incumbent race. Like, you always win the incumbent race. Who was the last one? Everybody wins their incumbent race. George W. Bush, I should say, was even elected again. His father was not. But George W. Bush, not widely considered to be an excellent president, he was reelected, right? And so for you not to win your presidential reelection as a political party these days, that's kind of a stinker. And the GOPs didn't like that too much. The Republicans didn't like that at all. And so we first heard about these restrictive voting laws, if you will, at the state level. We first heard about it in Georgia, and things have kind of spread since then. It was news a couple of months ago that Georgia's state legislator, Republican-led state legislator, was moving to pass a piece of legislation that, instead of expanding or in continuing to expand on some of the ideas that had been brought in during the course of the pandemic to make it easier for people to vote, instead of expanding upon those, they seemingly shrunk those down. And there were a lot of headlines that seemingly bounced off of that too, right? Like, people can't, under this new Georgia law, that people can't receive water in line. I don't know why that headline sort of dominated that story, but that was like the one thing that I'm going to remember from that push, is that, apparently the number one thing that people were worried about in the press was like, how can we vote if, people aren't able to get water in line, right? But in addition to that, the general idea of it was there was resistance to this law because it was shrinking the possibility that someone could cast a vote. It wasn't eliminating it, but it certainly was shrinking it. And since then, two things have happened, right? The GOP has replicated this. The Republicans have tried to replicate this strategy, and have actually successfully 30 different times. They've replicated this strategy at the state level in different through different bills rather. Since then, 30 different bills have been passed. Laws have been passed since the 2020 election that limit people's ability within a state to vote. Now, also happening today, too, in case you might have heard about it, there's a group of Texas Democrats that are in Washington, D.C. right now. And if you're wondering why are they in Washington and not in Washington, D.C., it's because in their state legislature is attempting to pass, again, more restrictive voting rights bills in Texas. And instead of losing this vote that they're most certainly going to lose if they show up and actually cast their votes, they've instead decided to fly the coop and go to Washington, D.C. instead. Hey, if you don't have all the members of the chamber in there to vote, if you don't have enough members of the chamber in there to vote, then they can't vote. So that's going to be a developing storyline. It's a political stunt for sure. Whenever we see these kind of things, we got to remember it's just for attention. But an interesting move nonetheless, right? Like, this has happened 30 times over, and the legislators in Texas were like, the Democrat ones were like, no, like, we're not just going to, let this happen. This is our only way of being able to pull any sort of leverage, even if it's just temporary, which it is just temporary. But anyway, what does all this mean? What is the breakdown and what is the take from this? The speech today that seemingly was so important, the Texas Democrats that are in Washington, D.C., what does this all mean, right? Well, the Dems, there's a few things going on here, right? But they really want to establish a blueprint for future elections that look a lot like 2020's election did. Not in the sense that people, of course, were scattered because of the pandemic, but they want it to look like voting and the process of voting is not something that has to kind of fit through this narrow understanding or narrow sort of definition, that it could be a very wide definition. Like, that's what the big deal is here. It's not about Joe Biden makes a great speech or the Democrats, blah, 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 whatever. This is about expanding that right to vote. Like, they want to keep that right to vote expanded for one important reason, because they win when people come out and vote. This is like my take on this. I think voting rights are important, and we'll get into that. But Democrats win typically when more people come out to vote. If larger numbers of people come out to vote, then Democrats will win. So you see a lot of Democrats pushing for this right now. And you see a lot of tweets going out. You see a lot of, support going out in different ways for this, and people trying to echo the president's sentiment today, trying to get in on the popular topic on the left of expanding the right to vote. Everybody can be down for that. Well, more importantly, they win when more people vote. Democrats win when more people vote. And typically, just according to the numbers, just how the numbers work, when more people vote, it's worse for Republicans. They usually lose those kinds of races. And so what Democrats want to replicate on a state and federal level is an environment that looked a lot like 2020 did, where a lot of people voted. Something that's important here. More Republicans voted too. It wasn't like, expanding voting laws. I'm sorry, not voting laws. Expanding voting registrations only helped the Democrats. More Republicans came out to vote too. It helped everybody across the board. But the problem is it helped the Democrats a little bit more than it helped the Republicans show up to the polls. And therein lies the problem. Of course, Republicans would like more people to come out and vote. That makes sense. But according to the strategy, the political gamesmanship, if you will, that goes on between Democrats and Republicans, it's about simple numbers. That's what this is really about. It's simple numbers. Like it's like hard for me sometimes. And this might be a hot take in this situation, but it's hard for me sometimes to believe that the collective effort that the Republicans have here, that the collective effort on behalf of the Republicans to suppress voting rights is based upon some sort of Jim Crow-esque sort of desire to return to. I don't think that's what's going on here. Just my personal take. I don't think that it's a Jim Crow-like assault on democracy. I think it is a strategy for one of the major political parties to win in this country. And both political parties understand the numbers behind having greater participation. Everybody understands it. And so that's why this is a thing. But it's a good storyline, right? If the Democrats, why even create this whole Jim Crow thing, or not create, rather, but why push this whole Jim Crow narrative, or the Republicans are racist, that they're trying to attack black people and all this other stuff? Why even push that narrative in the first place? Because that's what makes sense here for the Democrats. That's how you can paint the other side as being the enemy here. The other side wants to take away your vote because they want to win is not as strong an argument as the other side wants to take away your vote because they want to demolish democracy and they're racist. That second one sounds like a whole lot more tantalizing. If you're in the street and you're pitching me one of those two, I'm taking the second one, right? Whoa. Someone's trying to destroy democracy. Well, that sounds kind of important in America. The United States of America, I should say. It sounds kind of important. That's of importance to me. And also, you said something about racism? Whoa. That's the key word nowadays. If we can somehow bring this back to this concept of Jim Crow South, if the Democrats can tie their very important, if you will, quote unquote, very important message about the importance of the vote, if they can tie it to a past era, a time when, the restriction of voting rights to a particular group of people, black people in this country, was not about winning and losing. It was about the debilitation of human beings, of a particular race, of a particular color. It was about stamping on the neck of those people and ensuring that one's culture remained dominant over another one. That's what Jim Crow-like tactics mean to me when you start talking about suppressing the vote. What's going on here by the Republicans is not that. They just want to win. And they know that if more people show up, they're not going to win. So what do? You go from state to state, and you ensure and you create laws within those states that restrict the amount of people that are going to be able to show up to the polls. And this is why it's important. The Artist Key, by the way, says on the Instagram, it can't be both. That's a really great question. Question mark. She says it can't be both, like asking. That's a really great question. Like, why can't it be both? Like, why can't, listen, I understand. Are there people that are in the chamber? Are there representatives in the chamber, on both sides, by the way, that I believe harbor racist attitudes towards individuals, and that might be some sort of driver, or a little bit of momentum, or a little bit of motivation, rather, for them to vote the way that they do? Absolutely. 100%. I do believe that. But in terms of the gamesmanship, when we talk about, the battle, if you will, that goes on between Democrats and Republicans, it does become important for them to win the numbers game, especially around election time. It becomes absolutely the most important, by far, the most important thing to either political party. They have to. And so I do believe, like I said, that there may be a tinge of racism within the hearts of some of the individuals within the chamber, but this is all about survival. Like, this is 100% all about survival. And I think, related back to 2016 when Trump in 2020 rather, when Trump lost that election, the fight, if you will, if you want to call it that, the whatever the 30 days that occurred after that happened after that, was rife with false election claims and fraud claims and things like that. And the number one thing that Trump wanted to sort of get across to his base was that there were illegitimate votes cast, and that's the only reason why he lost that election. There were extra, and by illegitimate, he meant there were other ways that people were able to access the vote this year, that in 2016 they didn't have that same access. And he's hoping in the future they won't have that same access either. Because when you opened up the walls, if you will, of democracy like they did in 2020, albeit for a pandemic, but when you do that, so many more people have access to the vote. I don't think it was the idea that Joe Biden and Donald Trump were the most tantalizing presidential candidates to ever run, and that's why we had the largest turnout ever. I don't think it had anything to do with that. But I do think it had a lot to do with, the importance of this one, and the idea that you could vote in so many different ways. Who knew? This thing that seemingly is central to the way that we do business here in a democracy, the vote. Who knew that whenever you open up access to the vote to everybody, it works very well? I'm not saying it worked well because Biden won. I'm saying it worked well because a larger percentage of the people who are trying to figure out what the heck is going on in this country had a say in that leadership. And we can have all different types of conversations about how effective or ineffective that leadership is. And you're absolutely right to criticize that. But the process in and of itself has been flawed for a long time. Another hot take, right? I think that voter apathy is the number one enemy of voter turnout. That's the number one enemy of voter turnout. Voter suppression and the efforts that Republicans, at least these new efforts, like efforts in like the 60s and 50s, most definitely, you could make the argument we're having a tremendous direct impact on who showed up to the polls and who was actually physically allowed to cast a vote. But this new, as they call it, the new Jim Crow voter suppression that's going on, really, in my estimation, doesn't make, if you will, the efforts that the Republicans are trying to push here to kind of push back some of the expansion and kind of shrink some of the ways, like this sort of thing, this sort of strategy is not the number one thing that people should be focused on, or that officials should be focused on when it comes to getting people out to the polls. I'll just say that. I think it's an important issue. And by the way, I think the Democrats have made some good points about their expansion efforts and the law and the John Lewis Voting Rights Act and the For the People Act. I think there's some really good stuff in there, mostly good stuff in there about expanding, our need to do this. I think all of that is good stuff. But if we really want to focus on an issue, he was there in the city of Philadelphia for this speech. I thought that was interesting. And in Philadelphia, they've got a lot of issues surrounding poverty and crime, amongst some other things going on there. And this was the thing, right? Like, whenever I see the city of Philadelphia, I'm thinking, oh my gosh, there's so many things that he could be talking about here. So many real things that impact someone's decision about whether or not they are going to vote, more than one would think. Like, restricting voting rights is not like a hot thing around a place like Philadelphia. right? Like you ask people, hey, why don't you vote, right? And there are a lot of people in the city and many other cities that don't vote. But if you ask, hey, what are some reasons why you don't vote? I hate to be this guy, but like almost nobody that you're going to ask in that situation is going to say, you know what's restricting me from voting? Republicans' efforts, to suppress the vote. That's what's preventing me from voting. I would have voted, but if it wasn't for these, pesky Republican laws making it harder for me to cast a vote, like certainly that shaves the results in the numbers. We know that. But voter apathy is a much bigger issue. If you were to take a survey, and I'm so sure of this, if you were to take a survey of people who specifically do not vote in any city, Philly could be Philly, Pittsburgh, whatever. You take a survey of those people that do not vote, and you ask them, in all earnesty, why don't you vote? The overwhelming answer is going to be because I do not care. In some way, shape, or form, I do not care. People feel, and I've said this for so many years, people feel disconnected from the representatives that we have in Congress and the process, as well as the process that puts them there. They feel disconnected from that. They don't feel like their vote matters. They don't understand their, importance in the participation of the process. And then there's the eye test, right? Like you just look around you, look at what's happening. Look what seems to be happening. Not necessarily great things, especially when you from a political perspective. And so people take that and people remember these things. And they don't have trust and faith that anything good is going to come out of this. That's why people don't vote. That's the number one reason why people don't vote, in my estimation. You can tell me what you think on this, but, voter suppression has never been this issue that I've said to myself, oh my gosh, we really need to get this under control or else we're going to lose every election from here on out, right? If you want to get people to the polls, you have to make it important for them. The new Jim Crow is not going to prevent the Democrats or any other group for that matter from winning an election. Sorry. Just my 2 cents. But good ideas anyway. I do think that we should expand the ability for people to vote. Period. Point blank. But anyway, let me know what you think in the comments. I'll read some of your comments on the other side of this. We're going to take a quick break. Coming back on the other side, we'll talk about France, what they've decided to do with their healthcare workers and whether or not it's a viable strategy for something that could happen maybe here in the United States. I don't know. We'll talk about that. 30 seconds. We'll be right back after this.
Bernard, Parkour Athletic is apparel with a purpose. We're out to save the world and promote awareness for all ailments and disabilities.
When you do what you love, you're forever young, and you'll never, 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 never grow old. You'll never, 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 never grow old.
All right, and we are back. Make sure you leave your comments however you are listening to this. Make sure you leave your comments in the comment section. I'll do my best rather to read them for you here on the screen. Shout out to the folks on Instagram as well. Excuse me. So first half, talking a little bit about Joe Biden and voting rights. And don't get me wrong. In a country that's a democracy, we should always keep the protection of one's voting rights and how that's sort of dealt with and legislated. We should always keep a close eye on how that works. Of course, I'm for that. But right now, the Democrats are going to want some credit for this. I mentioned this before, that they're the kind of party that wants to be and that usually finds themselves on the right side of history. Lately, at least. And so they want to be on the right side of history on this one. And there are certain slam dunks that are very obvious things that they should push, especially as the more liberal party, that they're going to want credit for long after it happens. And I said it a couple of months ago that the Democrats are going to want credit for attempting to pass this bill. They're going to say, look, we are the party that actually wants to expand voting rights. And so we should be celebrated specifically for just wanting an expansion of voting rights. If it happens, who knows, right? But so far, from what we understand, the exact opposite has happened. Republican legislators across the country have made it actually more restrictive since 2020's election to vote in elections. So, I don't know. Tell me what you think. I thought that was interesting. I also thought this was interesting. I saw this headline actually right after we got off the air yesterday, and this is one that I know was going to get an interesting response. France, this is coming from Reuters, France insists health workers get COVID-19 shots as infections rise. Keeping an eye on this COVID stuff. Again, I'm no expert, so I'm not going to speak from a medical perspective and say, that I'm any sort of expert from that perspective. But I can see what's going on around, and hopefully we can make smart decisions about what we do with COVID, even from this point. All right, so the Reuters story, there's the headline: all the health workers in France must get a COVID-19 jab, and anyone wanting to get into a cinema or board a train must show proof of vaccination or a negative test under new rules announced by President Emmanuel Macron on Monday. It's pretty deep. So because this was written probably for a European audience, let me convert a few words here. Jabs means shots. Cinemas are movies. And boarding a train, well, that one's pretty much convertible too. But anyway, this is kind of a big deal for me. Healthcare workers will be required in France to get vaccinated, rather. Whether they like it or not, whether they are pro-vaccine or not, you will have to get a vaccine if you are a healthcare worker. Now, some of that has started to happen here in the United States in some places where they've basically said, like, you need to get this shot or else you will be let go or you will be released. It's a big thing in Texas, actually. Speaking of Texas, getting a lot of shout out on the show tonight. But it happened in Texas a little bit ago. It was very unfortunate, right? Because it kind of came down to this, like, individual freedoms versus what might be good for the general public. But as I always ask when it comes to the freedom question, if your individual freedoms impact somebody else's ability to be free, if you will, then is your freedom allowed? Should your freedom be allowed? If that's your definition of it. But anyway, that's a deeper question for another time. Let me go on with the French thing. Again, Health Minister Olivier Véran, I think that's how you say that in French. I took a couple years of French. Olivier Véran said health workers would not be allowed to go to work and would not be paid if they're not vaccinated against COVID by September the 15th. You got to have both shots if you're going to get one of the two-shotters. You got to have both shots by September 15th. Or else you're just not going to get paid. You're not going to be allowed at work. Now, the problem with France is a little bit different than it is here in the United States because they're only about 48%, I believe, of the population. Let me just get this percentage. I apologize. 40%. 40% of the total population are fully inoculated. Compared to the United States, where about 48 or so percent are fully inoculated at this point. Only 40%. 53% of French people have at least a single dose. Compare that to somewhere around 70%. I don't know what the percentage is today, but it was supposed to be 70% by the 4th of July. We missed that mark. We've been creeping somewhere around there since then, right? So about, let's call it 70% in the United States have at least one shot. In France, not exactly that. So the problem is over there, the same problem that we have here, and that's that the Delta variant is a lot stronger. It's a lot easier to spread than the original variant. And over the past month or so, almost every single death, with the exception of a very small few, have to COVID-19 rather have been this Delta variant. I'm sorry, not the Delta variant. Rather, the COVID-19 deaths, 99% of them have been for unvaccinated individuals. So there's kind of two big issues that are going on here. The Delta variant grows stronger the longer it's allowed to circulate within the community, and the community that we're talking about in this case only includes people who are unvaccinated. meaning that they're only a danger to themselves and the others that are like them in that sense. Vaccinated people can still spread, but not really get this new Delta variant. Anyway, the other part of this, in terms of health workers, was the movie part of it, which I thought was a little interesting. Macron said that a health pass, if you will, they're not calling this a vaccine passport, if you will, but a health pass will be required to attend large-scale events or to go clubbing, and will now be used more widely, including to enter restaurants, cinemas, and theaters. So they already had these passes, these as they call them, health passes, going on over there. If you wanted to go to the club, like you had to have the check. Like you either had to have a negative test, like you had to be recently tested and tested negative, or you had to show your card that says, or your proof, if you will, that you've been vaccinated. This is going on in France. And now they're expanding that to restaurants, cinemas, and theaters. And if you're going to be on the train, you got to have that pass too. Long distance, those that are boarding long distance trains, starting at the beginning of August, rather. So it gives people a further incentive, this article says, to get the shot. Now, those numbers are pretty low. Only 40% of the country is fully vaccinated. In France, obviously right there in the middle of Europe, very, harshly affected, if you will, by the coronavirus, like everybody was. But now they're trying this out. Now, the question that I had is there any chance that this comes to the United States? Is there any chance that there's enough political capital in this that this idea catches on in the United States? That's hard to predict. That's really hard to predict. This weekend, as recent as this weekend, Dr. Fauci, who's the nation's leading advisor, if you will, on viruses, this being a virus, we talk to and hear from Dr. Anthony Fauci a lot, and he said as recently as this weekend, again, that he supports this idea. Yes, vaccine requirements, having vaccine mandates for certain things to happen here in the United States. Dr. Fauci says, look, I think that we've needed to implement this, yes. Well, at the same time, the other side of this, of course, is that Republican legislators across the country, who have been busy, apparently, are creating laws that protect citizens from having to take the vaccine under, by force, basically. So you have two warring forces here. One that says, the medical professionals, that says, look, we need to get people vaccinated. We need to get people vaccinated because there's still a lot of people dying. More than 600,000 people here in the United States have died already, 607 or so thousand, and we need to prevent the further death of more people and the further increase of this Delta variant. We need to stop the strength increase of this Delta variant as well. So please get vaccinated, right? And then you got the Republicans on the other side that are saying, we're going to create laws that ensure that the government cannot mandate that you are vaccinated, creating for you this, sort of weird lull in between. But let me say this. This is what seems inevitable about this situation. Given the current status of the virus, this is what seems inevitable. That the virus is mutating, it's only infecting and killing those who are unvaxxed. The reality is that this Delta variant could go strong enough to create another significant spike that puts us right back to where we were as a society a year ago, where we're having to stay away from each other again, and we can't be in space, common spaces, and we got to wear masks and stuff like that. There's a chance that this Delta variant could put us right back there. And time again, COVID is proving and has proven that it's faster than the human race. It is adjusting, it is mutating, it is destroying, if you will, faster than humans can keep up with it. That is not a good pace. And so, obviously, the solution right now that we have is to get vaccinated. But there's a problem with that, too. The general public doesn't trust the science just yet. And I'm not talking about just the American public. I thought we were kind of the worst ones in all this. And we generally are when it comes to comparing world issues. But you can see, obviously, it's an issue in France, too. I mean, if everybody loved the idea of the vaccine, don't you think that that number would be a little higher of total vaxxed people? Would be a little bit higher than 40.6%? Just a little bit? Obviously, here in this country, rather, you have these warring political ideals as well. You know, if you don't want the government to touch your body or your guns or your Bible, then you're usually on one side of the line. And if you're more open to that kind of stuff, you're usually on the other side, but not always. This is one issue that I've noticed that I think sort of crosses over that political line. Just because, like, if you don't want a vaccine or you don't trust the government, if you will, you don't trust the science behind what's going on, it doesn't make you a Republican per se, although a lot of Republicans and conservatives feel that way. This is an issue that kind of blurs that line a bit, and that's the bigger issue here. It's not that Dr. Fauci isn't making enough sense. I think he's made plenty of sense since the beginning of this pandemic about getting vaccinated. But there's not a trust in central governments enough for them to say that, look, we have orchestrated a way for you to survive this thing that's killing everybody. And you still have a significant portion of the population that's like, you know what? I think I'm going to take my chances with the virus. That shows a level of trust that people don't have in the science just yet. And the idea that governments are right now the most name brand entity that can promote the use, if you will, or you getting a vaccine is a big problem. The biggest promoter of the product is an entity that a lot of people all over the world don't trust their own governments. So we are certainly at a crossroads. I've done plenty of other shows about, whether or not you should get vaccinated. I think you should get vaccinated if you have done the research behind it and you feel comfortable with that decision. I wouldn't advise people to intentionally not get vaccinated. I wouldn't advise that. But I think if you are going to get vaccinated, do so because you want to get vaccinated. Just saying. Anyway, let me know what you think in the comment section. Of course, if you're on Facebook, you're on YouTube, or you're on Twitch, you can leave it right there in the comments and I'll put it on the screen for you. If you're on Instagram, leave it there in the comment window, the comment stream, if you will, and I'll bring it up as is necessary. I'm going to get out of here, but before we do, one more story that somebody actually sent me this, and they said, hey, man, what do you think about this this situation going on in space right now, where you have billionaires shooting themselves into space over the next couple of weeks? And I was like, I don't know if I want to touch this. It doesn't really seem like it's a thing. But just as a bonus, a quick 5 here before we go. Richard Branson has funded his own trip. He's a billionaire. He is owner of like the Virgin brand. He's an entrepreneur, businessman. Look him up. Anyway, he has a lot of money to use on whatever he wants, and he decided to create a space fleet, if you will, a semi-space fleet that allowed him to experience weightlessness, if you will, about 53 or so miles above the atmosphere for a few minutes. Jeff Bezos, who's obviously another billionaire, he is like the billionaire right now when it comes to, the big B boys. He also promises that pretty soon he's going to be able to offer a pretty cool space experience for people to be able to fly into space if they so choose, and likely if they have the funds necessary for that to happen. And a lot of people are questioning this, saying, look, man, if we have the money, if somebody has the money to launch their own space rocket into space, can we like cure poverty or something? Or can we end homelessness? Can we build houses for the needy? I don't know, right? Like, there have been so many of these tweets and comments that I've seen today and yesterday about this topic. And I'm in the minority on this one. I think we did this to Michael Jordan a couple of years ago, and Michael Jordan actually gave in to the pressure. We said, to Michael Jordan, you are somebody that holds high importance in the black community. You have political capital in the black community. Not, by the way, because Michael Jordan was this community activist that did so much for black people. But what people said is they tied a common idea of the culture, his Jordan brand, to the idea that a lot of black people support his Jordan brand and pay through the nose to buy it in many cases where they do not have it even, right? And so we said, look, Jordan, black people are making a sacrifice for you, and you need to start making a sacrifice for black people. When somebody gets shot and killed by police or somebody else unjustly, you need to speak up. You need to say something. Now, people were like on Michael Jordan so much. How come you don't do this? How come you belong to this club, you belong to that club, but you don't give the Black Lives Matter, and you don't do this? Eventually, Michael Jordan gave in, and he said, fine, I will. He didn't say it like that quite, but I bet you there was a little bit of that going on in the background. But he said, okay, cool. Here's $1 million. And then he doubled that. Here's $2 million for Black Lives Matter organizations. And since then, he has, I feel, been guilted out of his corner, whatever luxury corner that he was sitting in. He's been guilted out of it to give to black causes because a bunch of people told him to. Give money, rather, to black causes. And that's never really sat well with me. There's another story this weekend, I guess, about one of the babies. I think it's one of the babies. Anyway, I guess somebody filmed him. The kids were out in the neighborhood. He was out in the neighborhood, and the kids go up selling, Skittles and whatever. And he gives them like a few bucks for the Skittles, and people are like, yo, how come you didn't like lace these kids with like a couple $100? Like you could, or a couple $1,000. Like you could have blessed these kids. You have so much money as an entertainer in the industry, baby, whichever baby you are. You have all this money. Why didn't you should have dropped it on those kids. And so like all three of these things, people are saying to Richard Branson, man, you got all this money. You should be ending homelessness. Michael Jordan, you got all this money. You should be helping black people. The baby, little baby, you got all this money. You should be giving all that money to them kids whenever you come by. Look, man, I'm of the ilk. Leave people alone. If they have a bunch of money and they have to this point not decided to spend it in a way that you might find magnanimous or whatever, then fine. Then that's how they want to live their life. You know what I mean? Like I always thought about the Michael Jordan thing. Like if Michael Jordan is sitting at home and he's watching the same news and he's hearing about the same stuff that we all are in the news with black people, and he, as knowing that he has these assets and everything else, Michael Jordan is not motivated to get up off the couch and do something on his own. If Michael Jordan looks at the same news that I'm looking at and he's not motivated to do something, then we know what kind of person Michael Jordan is. We don't have to tell Michael Jordan how to be the responsible or more responsible, if you will, with his money or the baby or Richard Branson or anyone else for that matter. So I think that we should back up off of these people for just a second. If Bezos wants to end homelessness, he can. He hasn't because he doesn't want to. And since we can't force people to tell them how to spend their money unless your name is Donald Sterling, former owner of the Los Angeles Clippers, since we can't do that, we should just let it rock. Let people have their moment and be happy for them or not. You don't have to be. But we can't tell other people what to do with their money. All right, that's all I got for tonight. Make sure you tune in tomorrow at 8 p.m. We'll be back with more news from the day. Appreciate folks for joining here on this show. If you want to follow the show, the instructions right there at the bottom left, anchor.fm/A Nichols Worth. It's your central location for where you can find everything A Nichols Worth on the podcast. Also, where you can donate or become a monthly subscriber as well. That makes you the real MVP. You can become a monthly subscriber of A Nichols Worth for as little as $1 a month. So check it out, anchor.fm/A Nichols Worth. If you are listening, if you want to listen rather on the go, make sure you check out my Instagram page. That's at Keaton D. Nichols. At Keaton D. Nichols. Get in on the conversation there as well. One more comment from the artist Key as we get out of here. She said, I think people need to consider what version of normal they want when it comes to the vaccine. But I don't know. That'll be a conversation for another day. Everybody take it easy. I will see you on the flip side on tomorrow at 8 p.m.